Welcome back. I'm going to take you through a Shadow Warrior Thorns build. This build can easily be used to farm the level 200 Tormented bosses and can also be used for pit tier 100 plus depending on how good your gear is. Now I'm showing you one of the Tormented boss battles against Duriel here. Our main part of damage that we're waiting for is the Thorns damage from our skeleton defenders. Once this hit, you can see we do massive damage with nearly 2/3 of its health going in one hit. This massive amount of damage is due to the warrior minions being hit, and due to the large amount of thorns it creates massive damage. So this build is perfect for farming the tormented bosses and can still be used in high level pit tiers without having to change the build, which I'll take you through later on in the video. In terms of the skills on the skill bar, the first one is Raise Skeleton. This is for the warriors and mages, which are the biggest part of our damage in this build. We're also using it to be able to help trigger Fueled by the Death passive to buff you and your minions damage. And we're also using it for the healing through the Blood Getters aspect as well, with the use of Skeleton Priests. For the second skill, we've got the Golem, which the active skill for this will help taunt enemies due to us using the Bone Golem. But the main reason we are also using it is to be able to help generate corpses and help fortify ourselves. Then we'll be using corpse tendrils for the buff it applies by applying vulnerable, and really for some crowd control to help pull the enemies together. In terms of the ultimate skill, I'm taking Army of the Dead just to help boost our minion damage for some support along with the Thorns damage we're going to be doing. Next we have Decrepify, which we're using to curse enemies for the additional damage reduction and cooldown reduction we'll be getting. And lastly we have Blood Mist on the skill bar, which we're using to help dodge attacks and to trigger corpse explosion through an aspect. Even though that's not on our skill bar, this will help us trigger the blighted aspect as well for some additional damage. Now I'm going to quickly take you through the skill tree to highlight some specific points that need to be focused on in terms of build synergies. Put your first 2 points into any of the starter skills, then going into the next area just put 1 into Unliving Energy and then 3 into Hued Flesh. This will unlock the next part of the skill tree. Then we're basically taking Blood Mist, so we want to put 3 points into that so we can also leave behind a corpse every 1 second. Take the Spiked Armor for the additional thorns and additional armor. Then put all your points into Warrior Master. 1 point into Grim Harvest, 3 into Fueled by Death for the increased damage after consuming corpses. And then although we don't have it on our skill bar, we are going to be unlocking Corpse Explosion and making it a darkness skill, as this is going to pair well with our Blood Mist and aspect later on. Then take Decrepify, and we want to be Abhorrent Decrepify so that we can do the lucky hit to help reduce our cooldowns. Then we're putting 2 points into Death's Embrace and 2 into Amplified Damage. And I've got 3 points into Skeletal Mage Mastery. After that, you want to put in some points into Corpse Tendrils and go into Plagued Corpse Tendrils, as we want to make them vulnerable. Then 3 points into Necrotic Carapace. This is to ensure we can help fortify ourselves, and this is what is pairing with the Golem active ability that generates corpses. So whenever you use that, it generates 5 corpses. It'll actually help fortify you during that as well. 1 point into Reaper's Pursuit, and we're doing 3 into Gloom and 3 into Terror. This is just to help with all the shadow damage our warrior skeletons and our mages are going to be doing to help buff that. 3 into the Golem Mastery just to help with some life and damage in that. We've taken Army of the Dead as our ultimate. 3 points into Inspiring Leader and 3 into Hellbent Commander. We do want that increase in damage. And then we're taking Shadow Blight, as we will be using the Blighted aspect as well. Now in terms of gameplay loop for the Tormented bosses, you're mainly waiting for your Thorns to do damage. However, you will want to use the Golem active ability to generate some corpses, so you can raise Skeleton Priests and use Corpse Tendrils. Then also ensure you Decrepify them as required. You can use Army of the Dead whenever it is available, and Blood Mist is there to help you with your survivability. However, if you have this build done correctly, the battles will be fairly short as shown for the Tormented bosses. Now for when you're going through groups of normal enemies like in the pit and other content, you usually want to try and decrepify as many enemies as possible for the buffs it provides, and to try and aggro the enemies and bring them together. Then use the golem active ability to drop some corpses in the middle of the group, and use corpse tendrils to pull them together. Now you can run over the group in blood mist to help trigger the blighted aspect, and don't forget to hit the Arm of the Dead ultimate when available in bigger battles. But that's pretty well it. It's not awfully complicated, and you can basically kind of rinse and repeat this as you go through. Now I'm going to be taking you through the aspects for the build. So we've got Hardened Bones on the helmet for the damage reduction, Razor Plate unique for the Thorns damage, which is the main kind of item for this build. Now because we're using that, that's why we're focusing on Warrior and Mages in this build, so that we can take the plus Skeletal, Mage and Warrior masteries. Golem mastery is on the chest armor, but we can't use that in this case. Gloves, Aphotic aspect, so that's empowering our warriors so they can do shadow damage. This is going to help proc the blighted aspect for us. Aspect of Cult Dominion for the increased minions. Bloodgaze aspect, so the Skeletal Priest is going to heal and buff our damage as well. Blighted aspect for some increased damage. We're using the Unyielding Commander's aspect to help give extra damage from Army of the Dead. Aspect of Reanimation for the increased minion damage. Needle Flare aspect to pair with the Thorns damage that we're dealing to help proc that and deal multiple parts of Thorn damage. And then finally the aspect of Explosive Mist on our shield. Now this will be ensuring that Blood Mist triggers corpse explosion on surrounding corpses, and once it does this, it's also going to reduce its cooldown for us as well, so this is going to be very helpful. On here, on the weapons, I've got Sapphires for vulnerable, armor, rubies for life, and then most likely on your amulet and rings, you'll be putting skulls just to try and make sure you hit the armor cap. If you're having trouble with resistances instead, depending on your armor, you can put in some diamonds in there instead. In terms of the Book of the Dead, so we are taking the Skeletal Defenders with the Taunt every 6 seconds. Now we're doing that so that the enemies will try and target them as much as possible, because that's where a lot of our Thorn damage will be coming from. We've got the Shadow Mages for the increased damage for each active Shadow Mage. And then the Golem, we want to be taking the Bone Golem with the one that will shed 5 corpses, which is going to be help generating our Fortify. Now going further into the gear stats, for the helmet, try and get max life, Thorns, ranks to Skeleton Warrior Master, and then for the tempers, max life, and Skeletal Warriors inherit your Thorns is the main thing. Gloves, intelligence, Mage Mastery, vulnerable damage, and then basically all the Timberings that can do it, we're going to be focusing on damage to close enemies. That's going to help us with the some of the minion damage, but then also with the Thorn damage. And then Skeletal Warriors inherit more of our Thorns wherever we can get that. Pants, we're doing Intelligence, Armor, and Skeletal Mage Mastery, and then Life and Thorns. On the boots, we're taking movement speed, resistance to all elements to help buff that and get to the cap a lot easier. Skeletal Warrior Mastery, and then movement speed and inherit Thorns. On the amulet, ranks to Hellbent Commander, intelligence, max life, damage to close, and Thorns. And then going into the rings, intelligence, max life, vulnerable damage, damage to close, and the ultimate cooldown reduction for both rings. Onto your weapon, we're looking at intelligence, vulnerable damage, max life, and then damage to close, and then minion attack speed. And then going over to offhand, we are taking a shield. You want to be getting a damage reduction, intelligence, and then Thorns. And then we're taking max life and inherit Thorns for Skeletal Warriors for the tempering. Okay, now I'm going to take you through the Paragon board. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I will talk through the boards and glyphs that I'm using. If you do want to see the full thing, I will have a link in the description that you can go for the full build guide. Now on the starting board, I am starting off with the Revenge glyph. This means Thorns damage increases all damage an enemy takes from you and your minions by up to 10%, which is a good pairing with this Thorns build. and you also get a bonus to some of the rare nodes that you take within range as well. Onto the second board, we're taking Cult Leader for the minion damage and the minion damage reduction that you can get, and then pairing that with Dead Razor as well. For the third board, Hulking Monstrosity and putting Undaunted in there for the increased damage and the damage reduction you'll get when you have Fortify, which is going to be all the time in this build. And then going into the fourth one, we're taking Bone Graft and then Essence, and that's to put some increased critical strike damage on, which will just help with some of that support minion damage as we go through. Now for the fifth one, we'll be taking Flesh Eater and then Corporal as the bonus. It will be meaning that the minions deal 10% increased physical damage, and you also gain movement speed for each minion active, which is a nice little buff. Going on to the sixth board, we're taking Territorial. This means we're going to get increased damage to close targets and also gain 15% damage reduction against close enemies. This does pair very well with this build as well. And then going into the seventh and final board, we are taking Exploit for the increased damage to vulnerable enemies, which we will be making vulnerable through the use of the Corpse Tendrils. Now, if you did find this video useful, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe for further content. It does help. And if you have any suggestions or questions around the build, feel free to pop them down in the comments and I will try and respond to them all.